Hello, friends. We're about to read chapter 11, To the Pacific. The captain's goal now was to reach the Pacific Ocean. Once they had done that, they could decide where to spend the winter. They could begin their return journey to St. Louis when the winter had passed. As their dugout canoes made their way down the Clearwater River, the explorers often traveled at great speed. But they faced one hazard after another. The boats hit rocks. They sprung leaks. Yet the captains had no wish to travel by land. Traveling by foot and carrying the boats and their supplies would slow them down. They were eager to reach their goal. On October 10th, 1805, the explorers rode into the Snake River. The Snake joined the Clearwater River from the south. That night, the expedition camped near the site of the present Lewiston, Idaho. That's not very far from where we are. Within a week, the expedition passed from the Snake River into the Columbia River. So now they finally reached the actual Columbia. The explorers had entered the present state of Washington. That's where we live. The captains bought food from the Native Americans. Mostly, it was salmon. We know a lot about salmon, don't we? In fact, the men became bored with a diet of fish. They also bought dogs from the Native Americans to eat. I know that's kind of sad, but they did. They ate dogs. Most of them actually preferred dog to dried salmon. Now, I've never eaten dog, so I don't know whether it's good or not, and I don't want to. I like to eat salmon. I don't want to ever eat dog. What do you think? Throughout this part of the journey, the Native Americans were always friendly. Clark believed that they were friendly because of Sacagawea. A woman with a party of men is a token of peace, Clark wrote. The explorers continued down the river. When the expedition stopped at night, the men were greeted by Wanapan. The Native Americans entertained the explorers with dancing and singing. About a week after the explorers entered the Columbia River, they reached the rapids above the Great Falls. The falls had a sheer drop of 20 feet. They are now known as Celilo Falls. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but it might be Celilo. It's Celilo. Celilo. Celilo? Celilo. I don't know. Find out. The canoes had to be unloaded. They were then lowered over the falls by ropes that the men had made out of elk skin. Below the falls, where the river widened, the explorers camped for 3 days. They needed to repair their canoes and dry their belongings. Their campsite was near the present city of The Dalles, Oregon. A problem developed when the men visited the Native American campsites. Their tents and lodges were infested with fleas. The fleas swarmed over the men. They couldn't even shake them off. Once, after stopping at a campsite, Clark wrote that every man of the party was obliged to strip naked so that they had the opportunity of brushing the fleas off their legs and bodies. Oh, man. I don't know if you've ever had experience with fleas before, but they are very hard to get rid of. On the river, the explorers moved at a brisk pace. They made 30 or more miles every day. There's Sundance. They began to see signs that they were getting close to the Pacific Ocean. One day, they spotted a Native American wearing a sailor's jacket. Well, that's a big clue, right? If a Native American on the entire other side of the continent is wearing something from someone from, white civilization, that means they're on the other side. And there's a way for other people to get to them via boat. So one day they saw a Native American wearing a sailor's jacket. He had no doubt gotten it from a British ship that had traded for furs along the coast. On November 7th, the day dawned with a heavy fog. But by mid-afternoon, the sky cleared. Then came the moment they had all awaited. "Great joy in camp," Clark wrote. "We are in view of the ocean, the great Pacific Ocean we have been so long anxious to see." They could hear the ocean's waves breaking on the rocks. Clark also noted ocean 4,142 miles from the mouth of the Missouri River. There was no celebration. It was raining too hard, but each man must have felt a sense of triumph and one of relief. When Clark declared that the explorers had reached the Pacific Ocean, he was not exactly right. What the captains had looked out upon was the wide mouth of the Columbia River. It was as long as 6 miles across. The Columbia not only looked like the Pacific Ocean, but it was salty and tasted like the ocean. It felt like the ocean, too. When the men tried paddling their dugout canoes in the river, they bobbed around like pieces of driftwood, and some of them got seasick. On November 17, 1805, Clark announced that he was setting out by foot the next day to see the main ocean, or the real ocean. Anyone who wanted to join him should be ready to start early the next morning. 10 men agreed to go along. Heading west from their campsite on the north bank of the Columbia, the party trudged several miles to Camp Disappointment. John Marks, a British explorer who had visited the area in 1788, had named the site. Clark and his men climbed a hill and looked to the west. He wrote, "The men appear much satisfied with their trip, beholding the astonishment, the high waves dashing against the rocks, and this immense ocean." This time they had truly reached the Pacific Ocean. So if you all have been to the Seattle waterfront, you know that's not the Pacific Ocean. That's the Puget Sound. You still have to drive another almost 2 hours to get to the actual ocean. Seattle is not the ocean. Seattle is the Puget Sound. So if you're inland and you see what looks like the ocean, you could be tricked. And, these guys, they didn't know for sure. But then they realized, oh, we have not actually reached the real ocean. So then they had to travel farther. During the next several weeks, the explorers searched for a winter campsite. After crossing to the south shore of the Columbia River, they finally found what seemed like a good spot. It was located on a small bluff overlooking the present Lewis and Clark River. Google that. Find out, where's the Lewis and Clark River? What does it look like now? And it was located on a small bluff overlooking the present Lewis and Clark River, about 3 miles from its mouth. A nearby spring could provide fresh water. Big fir trees were all around. They could be cut down to make a fort. Native Americans had told them that the site was near good hunting grounds. Working in the rain, the men built a log cabin stockade with several rooms. It rained almost every day. When it did not rain, the sky was overcast. On December 16th, Clark wrote, "The wind's violent, trees falling in every direction, whirlwinds with gusts of rain, hail, and thunder. This kind of weather lasts all day. Certainly one of the worst days that ever was." Now, boys and girls, you are all from the Pacific Northwest, so you are used to this. It rains a lot in the area that we live in, and it can become pretty depressing, can't it? Now imagine you don't have a nice warm house and a nice warm fire and nice warm jammies and a nice cup of hot cocoa, but you're just freezing and tired and cold and wet, and it just won't stop raining every day. Just rain, rain, rain. That's how these guys were living. That's hard. A good number of the men became ill. Some had boils. Others suffered from dysentery. One man strained a knee. Another broke a shoulder. Elk meat they had tried to keep went bad because it was so damp. Even their dried salmon became moldy. The men's clothing became mildewed and just rotted. That can really be hard on a person's psyche. By Christmas Day of 1805, work on the cabins was nearing completion. The captains gave out tobacco to those who smoked or chewed it. Those who did not use tobacco received handkerchiefs. But it was not a festive day. That means they didn't really feel very happy or feeling like having a party. Showery, wet, and disagreeable, Clark said. That was how Christmas was in 1805 on the Pacific Northwest coast. Parties of Clatsop, the Native Americans who lived in the area, were regular visitors of the fort. At first, the explorers communicated with the Clatsop by means of sign language, but eventually Drouillet learned to speak the Chinook language, which was used by the Clatsop. Many of the men learned Chinook words and phrases. Boredom was the chief problem at Fort Clatsop. The entry, "Not any occurrences today worthy of notice," appears in Lewis's daily log over and over through January, February, and into March of 1806. It was never as cold as it had been at Fort Mandan the winter before, but at Fort Clatsop it rained. It rained almost every day. Sometimes the rain would change to snow. Then it would change back to rain again. The captains organized groups of men into hunting parties. They were sent out daily. They brought back more than 100 elk that winter. Deer and bear were also hunted. Sometimes the hunters picked berries for the men. The men spent a good deal of time making clothes and footwear for their return journey. They made over 300 pairs of moccasins out of elk skin. Each member of the expedition, thus, had about 10 pairs of moccasins. Making moccasins kept the men busy. They also made shirts and trousers for the return trip. The captains hoped to be able to leave Fort Clatsop on March 20th, but rain and violent winds made the river too rough for canoe travel. They had to postpone their departure. So not long after noon, on March 23rd, 1806, the explorers started out. Speaking of Fort Clatsop, Clark wrote, "At this place we had wintered and remained from the 7th of December, 1805, to this day, and have lived as well as we had any right to expect. And we can say that we were never one day without 3 meals of some kind, either poor elk meat or roots." Clark, however, complained about the rain, which he noted has fallen almost constantly since we passed the Long Narrows. We know what that's like, don't we? Almost every day having rain. Ugh, that's really a bummer. I'm going to show you the picture, which is the reconstruction of Fort Clatsop, located just south of Astoria, Oregon. Google it. Check it out. Fort Clatsop. Clatsop. Fort Clatsop. Check it out. Here's a picture. It's a reconstruction. It's not what Lewis and Clark actually built. All right. Have fun doing that, and I'll see you for the next chapter. Bye.